Welcome to the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Radiologists' 90th anniversary podcast series, where we celebrate 9 decades of excellence in radiology and radiation oncology. In this special series, we honour the remarkable careers, achievements and contributions of our members who have shaped our college and the profession. Today we're delighted to feature Dr. Tom Snow, whose dedication and service to RANZCR have left an indelible mark on our RANZCR community. Dr. Snow has generously volunteered in various roles over the years, contributing his time, expertise and passion to advance our mission. Notably, he served as a board member from 2013 to 2017. In this episode, Dr. Snow shares the highlights of his illustrious career and the achievements he's most proud of. His journey exemplifies dedication and excellence in clinical radiology. The stories and insights he provides offer a unique perspective on the evolution of the college and the specialty. We're honoured to share his experiences with you in this podcast. We hope you enjoy listening to this episode.
When I was a houseman, I saw a radiologist do an ultrasound-guided cyst aspiration, which I'd never seen done before. At that time, the whole idea of interventional radiology was not really a concept that anybody knew anything of. So it was fairly dramatic for him to watch him putting the ultrasound probe on and being able to see the cyst. And then it was very dramatic then for him just to stick a needle in it. And that would have been in about 1986. And I realized that a lot of what we were doing, learning medicine, was about to be bypassed by the fact that we would be able to see directly inside people. A lot of the things that we learned were rather indirect ways of working out what was happening inside people by, for example, recording the electrical currents coming out of their heart or by attempting to feel the size of their organs through the abdominal wall. You know, as medical students, we learned a tremendous amount of that. Or even more crazy, by listening to the sounds that their organs make by using a stethoscope. And then to see that, in fact, very quickly we would be able to look directly at those organs by ultrasound or by CT or subsequently by MR was quite a revelation. And obviously a lot of the things that we learned at medical school were going to be redundant and or at least very weak by comparison with the tools that were going to become available. And of course those tools would become available to radiologists before they became available to everybody else. So that seemed to me a very exciting notion that radiologists were about to get a huge head start on everybody else. And then the other thing is that I was very interested in computers, and I had done some very lame programming when I was at school. Obviously there weren't many computers around. We had a Sinclair ZX Spectrum at home on which you could do some very primitive computing. And I realized that computers were going to make a big difference in medicine, and the place where computers and medicine interacted most obviously and most strongly was in radiology. So those two things sort of set me about it. I really enjoyed lots of the things that we did when we went through medical school. It's like a long careers fair. You did some obstetrics, and then you did some surgery, and you did some dermatology, and I liked all of these things. I thought, oh yeah, I could do that. I wouldn't mind being a psychiatrist. I wouldn't mind being an obstetrician, all of these things. But radiology seemed to me to be one of the places in the hospital where news gets generated. When you're a resident, you trog around the hospital, and there are a few places where things are happening that you need to know about. You ring them up and say, what's going on? One's the emergency department, one's the operating theatre, and the other was the radiology department. We found ourselves often going to radiology trying to find out what's the answer with my patient. You know, what have you found? Because a lot of the important decisions got made out of what was discovered in radiology. So all of those things sort of converged. When I was a resident, I saw this guy do that cyst aspiration. I thought, aha, okay, there's a niche. There's a good niche for me. And at the time, I was halfway between medicine and surgery, didn't really know which way to go. Suddenly it seemed like, oh yeah, radiology, that's a good way to keep yourself across all of the specialties. You get to see everybody's interesting patients. So I thought when I was a resident, okay, I'll do that. And then I was sort of lined up to go on to the surgical training program, so I started on that I was initially an anatomy demonstrator in Bristol, which was fantastic because you got to learn all your anatomy while you were teaching it, and it was fun teaching, and we did a lot of dissecting, and I knew that having all that anatomy to a good standard would see me well in radiology. I did the first part of the surgeon's exams, which was one of the worst things I've ever had to do, but from that job it wasn't that difficult to pass. It was a horrible amount of work, but we were able to pass it. And then to everybody's surprise, instead of passing on from doing the first part of the surgeon's exams into the surgical training program, I decided to jump out. And in fact, I went to do medicine. I did about 2 years of medicine because I felt that being a junior surgeon, being a surgical trainee in the first couple of years was not terribly valuable to radiology, whereas being a physician trainee would be quite valuable to radiology. And so I spent 2 years being a physician, doing neurology and cardiology, and doing the physician's exams. I did both parts of the physician's exam. And at that time, having the physician's exam was a sort of entry requirement for radiology. But by that time, I had a bit broader CV than most people. I'd done some surgery and I'd done some medicine, and I'd got all these exams, and I'd written some research, and so by the time I came to apply to radiology, I was pretty much set. And at that time, the president of the college in London was a Bristol radiologist called Rhys Davies, and because I was based in Bristol at that time, I decided that I would apply in Bristol. It was probably the most difficult program to get on at that time, but I was able to get on, and that was good. I think in retrospect, Bristol was on the decline already at that time, and I would have been better placed elsewhere. Particularly, I probably missed an opportunity to go to London. But anyway, I ended up training in Bristol.
Would you like to just now reflect on your career? So obviously starting in the UK, how did you get to Australia? Was it a lifestyle change you were looking for, or a job opportunity?
So I went onto the training program in Bristol, and there was a long gap between getting appointed and the program starting. So I was fixed up to do a neurosurgery job, which is I was interested in those sort of things where medicine and surgery cross over. So I was fixed up to do a neurosurgery job in Bristol, but in fact I got onto the radiology training program, and there became no point in doing that. And I had about 9 months where I could do whatever I like. And I'd never been to Australia. People told me it was terribly boring. And I think my uncle told me when I was a little kid that Australia was very boring. And so I'd always put it out of my mind, I won't bother going there. But then I had this 9-month period where I could do whatever I like. And the BMJ always has some adverts for Australian things in the back. And I thought, okay, I'll go and do that. And one place that was advertising was Gold Coast, and I presumed that Gold Coast must be up by the sea. I really didn't know any more about it than that. And I had an exchange of correspondence with them, and I wrote to them saying I would be happy to come as a medical registrar, but I would only wanted to do cardiology. Well, little did I know that at that time nobody wanted to do cardiology in the Gold Coast, and so they were wrapped. And I flew out here and became a cardiology registrar on the Gold Coast. I worked about 3 months here. It was beautiful, from February to March of 1990, February to April of 1990. It was beautiful on the coast. We had a tremendous lot of fun. There was a lot of very interesting young people around in the hospital at that time. The hospital was quite a happy place, much happier than hospitals that I'd worked in the UK. It was really quite a transformation. And I then went, when the weather started to get a bit rainy here on the coast, I moved to Cairns. I did 3 months up in Cairns Base Hospital, and also had a very happy, interesting time, and loved Cairns. And so then I went back to England to go back onto my training program, but I had it already in my mind, actually that would be really quite nice to work in Australia. I didn't really take it too seriously, but anyway, then I did my training in Bristol. I did 3 years to the exam. I took the exam in London. The exam actually was really quite easy in London. That's another thing that I was reflecting on yesterday with Nicola Strickland, is people who've done both exams, both the Australian and the English exam. The Australian exam is a bit more challenging, and I'll probably come back to that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But I came towards the end of my training in Bristol. I did a year in Plymouth, very happy year in Plymouth, and Plymouth is now a bit of a powerhouse for radiology. And I then I decided I wanted to do interventional, and I applied for jobs in the States. I did USMLE. I went on a little tour around the States and Canada, and eventually scored myself a fellowship position in Toronto. But once again, that didn't start for a year. So then I had another year where I thought, well, there's no point in hanging around in Bristol for another year being a fifth-year trainee. I might as well go and do something else. And once again, I looked in the BMJ, and the Royal Brisbane was advertising for a radiology fellow. I thought, that's the job for me. And I got married that week. I got married the week that the Royal Brisbane wrote to me and said, yeah, we've got a position for you. And I didn't have a chance to tell my fiancée. So when we got in the wedding car, I said to her, hey, you better have a look at this. We're going to Brisbane. So she was pretty amazed. She hadn't really signed up for that deal. But by that time, it was too late. So we arrived in Brisbane in '95, and we arrived with a small child and quite a lot of luggage, and they dropped us the taxi dropped us off in Hurston at the top of the hill, and the hospital had given us an apartment, which turned out to be the most beautiful apartment in the old nursing home, looking out over the jacaranda and a swimming pool. But when we arrived, we were overloaded with baby gear and luggage and whatnot. And a charming elderly man stopped and asked us if he could help. And he helped us carry our bags up the stairs. It turned out to be John Pern, who was a famous paediatrician and a campaigner against landmines. He's very well known. The most charming man, but it's typical of him that he would stop and help some young people that he saw were stranded by the side of the road. But that was the beginning of a very happy year in Royal Brisbane. We were treated so well. People were so friendly. And I was very happy at work there. And they bumped me up from being a fellow to being a consultant, and I suddenly made quite a bit more wages than I was accustomed to. And we lived in a little house in Hurston, and it was beautiful. And that really set me to the idea of, well, it wouldn't be a bad option to come back here. And while I was there, a job in the Gold Coast was advertised, and I came here to interview, and I said, look, I'd love to take this job. I was the only applicant. I'd love to take this job, but I have to go to Toronto and finish my training. And they said, okay, well, we'll hold the job for you for a year and a half, which was pretty amazing. And so we finished up in Brisbane, and we went to Toronto. And in Toronto, things were very bleak by comparison. Ontario was in the middle of a terrible fiscal crunch, so the departments were very run down, the radiologists were very impoverished, the fellows got paid hardly anything at all. We did a massive amount of on-call. Initially, when we arrived there, the weather was quite jolly, and Toronto's not a bad city, but very quickly the weather turned bad and the streets froze over, and I couldn't cycle to work anymore. We had no parking space, and it became quickly apparent that we were going to have a much harder time in Toronto than in Brisbane. In fact, my wife moved us. We were in a house sort of on the edge of the city. It would take me about half an hour to cycle in, which in the summer seemed okay, though the Toronto traffic is terrible. But by the beginning of the winter, it was clear we just weren't going to do out there. And so she moved us to a little tiny one-bedroom apartment close into the hospital, and so we slept with the two of us and the baby in the same room, and that was actually much better. It was kind of cozy and close to work, and we didn't have to worry about the heating. And I could also, Toronto becomes very unpleasant in the depths of the winter, and you know that they all go around underground, and I could get from our apartment block, I could go underneath the streets all the way into the hospital and up into the angio lab without having to go out into the snow. And all through that winter, we just sat there in our little apartment. We had hardly any money. I worked very hard. I did a massive load of on-call. A lot of the consultant radiologists would go away to the Caribbean in the depths of the winter, and they would leave the fellows behind to mind the shop. And so it was a bit of a baptism by fire. Particularly, we did a month of vascular and a month of non-vascular alternating. The month of non-vascular was fairly gentle, but the month of vascular was absolutely bloody, and we worked very long days with pretty ordinary equipment and very challenging cases, and by the end of each month of doing vascular, I used to be a bit sort of burnt out and traumatized. And the whole thing was such a contrast with Brisbane, where everything had been very cool and controlled and jolly. And so at the end of our time in Toronto, we went back to England. I scoped around about a few jobs in England, but none of them were as appealing as the job I had already lined up in the Gold Coast. We had another baby while we were in England, and then we decided, okay, well, we'll go and take up that job in the Gold Coast. And that was in 1997, and I've essentially been in the same job with a few variations. I've been in the same job from 1997 to 2017. And the Gold Coast was quite a small place, medically speaking, quite a small place in the late 90s. When I arrived, there were only 2 other radiologists in the department, so there was no interventional radiology to speak of. And so I could arrive, and they had a decent little room, and they allowed me to buy equipment and to train the nurses and to recruit people. And I was gradually able to build up that service in Gold Coast, not bringing it up to the same level as the services were available in Brisbane, but at least able to provide some things so that patients didn't have to be transferred all the time from Gold Coast to Brisbane. And that's gradually been the process over the 20 years. So when I arrived, there were two FTE consultants at Gold Coast, and now there are 23. So it's grown massively over that time. And for a lot of that time, I was able to influence the development of the department. I acted as the director from about 2001, but I wasn't actually named as the director until 2007, and I worked as the director officially from 2007 to 2014. During that time, everything gradually built up. We installed more CT, we took over another hospital at Robina. We had a bit of a triumph getting a magnet license. We initially installed 1 magnet, we now have 5 magnets. So all of that has sort of grown exponentially. And then the other thing that happened in the middle of that time was that the state government decided to build an enormous new hospital, which was inevitable. In fact, when I arrived, it was clear that the 1970s tower block that we were in was going to be inadequate very rapidly. The population on the Gold Coast has been growing all of that time, and public hospital services were overloaded right from the get-go. And in the middle of the mining boom, it's 2005 to 2007, there was money pouring through Queensland government. We were running these surpluses, and the government was looking around for infrastructure to build, and the obvious thing to do was to build some public hospitals. So at that time, the public hospitals, the redevelopment of the Children's, redevelopment of Royal Brisbane, PA, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast were all planned in that time. And Gold Coast was planned on a grand scale. Initially, it's 900 beds, and then scaled down to 750 beds. But money appeared to be no object in 2007. The initial projections that it would cost about 1.5 billion. Then when the plans went through, it was going to cost more like 1.8 billion, and the government just said, "Fine, we'll spend the extra money," and ended up spending 1.8 billion, which at the time that it was built was the most expensive single build hospital anywhere in the world. So it's quite a commitment on the part of the state government to a piece of infrastructure like that. But I mean, clearly, that's what government's for, is to take all that mining wealth and turn it into some assets for the community. So it was a privilege to be around while that was going on, and I was amazed how much consultation was made with us about what we wanted, and really we got pretty much everything that we asked for. I thought that the process would be a series of ambit claims. So they would say, how many MR scanners are you going to need in 2015, and we'd say
10.
Yeah, we'd say 10, and then they'd say, well, be realistic, you can have 5.
Yeah.
But in fact, we said, well, we'll need 5, and they never came back with it. They just said, okay, 5 it is, and that's where we are. And I'm glad that it turned out like that, because obviously what seemed a ridiculous number in 2007 actually turns out to be a realistic number in 2015, and probably an inadequate number in 2030. So we've grown into the hospital's only been open since 2013, but we're already grown into it, and the bed stock is often full. So they certainly didn't overbuild it. And from an interventional point of view, we're always aware interventional radiology is inventing procedures for other specialties to steal since the 1960s, and we've always been aware that struggle is going on, and in new hospitals, one tendency is for interventional radiology type services to get hived out of the X-ray department. And so these hybrid operating theatres where you have an X-ray set and all the facilities to do an open laparotomy or open surgical procedures, they are a force for dragging work out of the X-ray department and giving it to other people. And in many places that's been the way it's gone, is that vascular surgeons have been able to take their work out of the X-ray department and move it into an operating theatre. And we were very aware when the hospital was being built that was a danger that we faced. Because we don't control the patient, we work by referral from other specialists, it was likely that we would be disenfranchised by that. And so when they came to us and said, look, they didn't want to have the angio suites in the X-ray department, because if we want to do general anaesthetics and whatnot, the anaesthetists don't want to be out of their zone, they want to be in theatres. So we said, okay, well, we'll move our angio suites to theatres, but we have to take a whole slab of the X-ray department with it. It means that we have to have consulting rooms, we have to have reporting rooms, we have to have offices, we have to have admin staff, we have to have somewhere for the nurses to be and for the radiographers to be, somewhere for them to keep their stuff, change rooms, everything. And so we built essentially a mini version of the X-ray department up in the operating theatre, and that allowed us to retain control of those angio rooms, because we're always there, our admin people are always there, the nurses are always ours. And that's been a tremendous advantage, because it's meant, although the surgeons were controlling the patients, we control the real estate, and so it's forced us to work together. Yeah. And I think that's been a very good model. And I look around at other establishments and think, it's a shame that the surgeons don't have to collaborate with the radiologists so much.
So you've touched on this next subject a bit. You've experienced going through med school, equipment when you came out it was no longer available. You mentioned when you were in Toronto, the hospital was so lacking in funds that you were using very outdated equipment. Through to the current project of building this brand new hospital on the Gold Coast, you've seen such trends in equipment and technologies over your career. Would you like to reflect a little bit about the changes in these equipment and technologies that you have witnessed?
Sure. So that's a long view thing, I think, because although the technologies have been gradually evolving, and there's been a few occasions when there's been a sort of paradigm shift where, for example, when ultrasound was introduced to medicine, or when CT was introduced to medicine, those would be sort of major game-changing sort of things. And then there's obviously incremental improvement over time. So our CT scanners have got much better than they were 20 years ago. Ultrasound has become much more available and much more portable than it was 20 years. So those are real trends that you see evolving over time. But superimposed on that, we see a lot of short-term enthusiasm for new technology, which appears in the workplace and then disappears again. And that's because doctors, I think, like new stuff. They like to feel that they're at the cutting edge. They like to have a new solution for a problem that's vexing them, but also because there's very powerful commercial interests trying to sell you new things and new technologies and new operations and so forth. And so we see recurring cycles of new devices about which there's a lot of enthusiasm. People use it a bit. The real life experiences aren't quite as good as was hoped. Sometimes there'll be a clinical trial which shows that actually the thing doesn't really perform as well, and then that device then either fades from use or that carries on at some low level. And there are multiple examples of that. There are some where the device or the technology or the operation has come into favour and then fallen out of favour completely, so that it's been abandoned. And right from the get-go, we've seen those things happen. So, for example, when I was a trainee, it was very fashionable to have lasers with which you could recanalize arteries. And interventional radiology labs were equipped with laser protection, and the radiologists had to have laser training. They had to be laser accredited, and they had all these laser signs everywhere, and you had to wear special glasses in case the laser went in your eye. And they worked by, the laser was shone down a fibre optic, down a fibre to the end of the catheter, and then would either shine out of the end and heat the tissue directly, or it would hit the end of the catheter and heat the tip of the catheter. But either way, that heat was used then to blast through the atheroma or whatever it was that was blocking the artery. But quite quickly, it was found that there were quite a lot of perforations, that you made holes through the artery inadvertently. Instead of going down the lumen of the artery, you ended up going through the wall. And it was also shown that the rate of recanalization, so your ability to go through a blocked artery, wasn't affected by whether you turned the laser on or not. It was really just a mechanical effect of the catheter. And so people were kind of burned by that. No pun intended. People were kind of disillusioned that they had bought into this newfangled technology, and then it turned out to be just a bit of a furphy, and they'd invested a lot of time and money in it, and then abandoned it.
A marketing ploy.
Yeah. and so those things have come around again and again. I mean, in recent times, we have renal denervation, which is where you burn the sympathetic nerves to the kidney, which people invested a huge amount of time and effort into learning. And there's huge competition between the companies trying to bring these products to market. But they did a big trial in order to get FDA approval, and the trial failed. It turned out the thing is not effective in reducing people's blood pressure, and so it's all abandoned again. We had carotid stent. Everybody taught themselves to do carotid stent for atheroma in the internal carotid artery. But then there were two trials which showed that it was more dangerous than the open operation. The trials were flawed for various reasons. But carotid stent's then been abandoned pretty much. We just don't do it anymore. And so those technological sort of trends are going on continuously. One amusing one is atherectomy, so you can make a catheter which goes down the middle of the artery and then cuts out the bits of atheroma. And there are various designs. There's some which drill, there are some which vaporize, there are some which have some sort of water jets that crush the stuff up. There's often ones with like cutting blades which shave off the stuff and then aspirate it. Various designs of atherectomy catheter. They all essentially don't work because they do so much damage that the artery doesn't survive a thrombosis afterwards. But those products have come back to the market roughly on a 7-year cycle. I think 7 years is long enough for the companies to sort of rebrand it, rename it, and bring it back to the market, and for the radiologists to forget, oh yeah, didn't we try that already? And interestingly, that the atherectomy catheters are just being presented to us again now, so we must be on the next 7-year cycle. Now, you were asking about trends in technology. So those are the trends that have been sort of dominating the last 20 years. obviously other people will have reflected with you about trends for the next 20 years. It looks like we're not going to have another big machine. PET-CT was the last big machine paradigm shift. It doesn't look as though there's another one of those people, and PET-MR is probably going to be a much more niche sort of thing. It doesn't look as though there's another one of those appearing on the horizon, or at least as far as I can tell. What's more likely is that we're going to see machine reporting as the next big thing. Probably over the next decade, we're going to have machine reporting, which is really going to disrupt the way we're currently working. There's a lot of people trying to make machine reporting work because radiologists are very expensive, and so there's a tremendous commercial drive to automate what they do, replace them with a computer, and the computers are good at things which radiologists are not good at. So they're good at vigilance, they're good at staying awake, they're good at not missing things, and so those things which radiologists don't do well are ripe for replacement by a machine. And so for those two reasons, I think that machine reporting is going to be with us very quickly, and the next challenge for radiologists is to make themselves, to accommodate that change, that disruption. And my optimistic view is that that's fantastic, because at the moment radiologists are burdened by a lot too much work. There's too much stuff. There's just piles, well, it's not piles anymore, it's long lists of reporting that they have to get through, some of which is not very valuable, some of which the radiologist is not adding very much value to the clinician. And so I think that's distracting them from what they should be doing. This is my own view.
Absolutely, that's what we're for.
Is that they should be concentrating on things where they are adding value, where they understand the clinical context and they bring their experience and the breadth of their training to bear on those clinical problems, and they're able to concentrate on them properly without worrying that they are missing stuff. In other words, the machine will say there's these rib fractures and these other things that, make sure that you've seen all of these things. The machine will do the vigilance stuff and the completeness stuff. But the machine is not very likely to be good at the more complex sort of human things, interactions with doctors, understanding the clinical context, knowing what might be appropriate next in that particular patient's management. So my optimistic view is that radiologists will be released from a lot of the drudgery that they have now to go back into being the sort of value-adding doctors that I wanted to be. In fact, we have managed to be like that for our whole careers, but now the burden of reporting is becoming excessive.
Yeah. I can imagine that there would be the odd case that can't be picked up by a computer as well, because it might be such a rare or unusual, or maybe I watch too much American TV as well.
Yeah, there are all sorts of. I mean, automating radiology is this is a common problem which is happening in multiple industries, happening in airlines, happening in transportation. The problem with having a computer take over a sort of middle complexity job like flying an aeroplane or driving a car is that when the computer fails, the humans don't have the necessary experience to be able to take over again. Especially seeing as the computer will fail in a circumstance where things are extremely unusual.
Yeah.
And so we know that happens in the airline industry, is that pilots are being de-skilled by their autopilot. When the autopilot fails, the pilot's lacking the experience to deal with that situation. And a similar effect will probably happen in radiology. is that we'll get de-skilled, but I hope that we get de-skilled about things which are not very interesting or important, like picking up the counting all the rib fractures or counting all the lung nodules. Those sort of things which the machine will be good at, and I don't think we are terribly good at. So that's where I think the technology is going. Is machine reporting will be a big deal, but I must say I think it's going to be quite a while before they have machines to do interventional. And well, that's one of the reasons that I trained as an interventionist, is that I knew that it would be difficult to send my work away by teleradiology, and also difficult for computers to take my work away because of the nature of it.
Over the years, you've sat on many committees at the college, ASM standing committees, Queensland branch chair, rural special interest groups, and you're currently a college board member. Would you like to reflect on your time spent in the college and serving the college?
Yes, I never expected that I would have anything to do with the college. I'd always been regarded myself as a bit of an outsider, and some of my views I thought weren't really in the mainstream. In fact, some of my views over time have been so at variance with other college members that it's caused some trouble, and I might come back to that. But when I arrived in Australia, I had to do the Australian exam, and so as usual, one's initial contact with the college is not all that pleasant. And just like doing the exam in London, all you know of the Royal College of Radiologists is these creepy exam rooms that you have to go in. But at least in London, the exam was kind of fun. We were sort of way over prepared, and the writtens weren't very difficult, and the vivas were amusing. Like, the examiners were very friendly, and they showed you a lot of interesting films which weren't very difficult. Like, maybe they were difficult, but we'd seen them similar things before. A lot of it was kind of Aunt Minnie-ish sort of things where they put the film goes up and you recognise what it is. So then it's a chance to show off, and I remember laughing a lot during those vivas and getting through lots of cases, and they were fun. Whereas in Australia, the exam was much more of a dour affair. The examiners didn't really converse with you very much. They didn't smile or help you. I remember them in a paediatrics viva I had, they just put the films up and sat in silence while I said some things which were not terribly convincing, and they didn't say anything at all, and they just took the films down again. And that was it. I mean, I was relieved to pass in Sydney, but there was really no way of knowing that you were passing, whereas in London it was obvious. So that one's first experience of the college is of exams, and I never really thought too much about the college after that until we started having trainees in the Gold Coast Radiology department. Initially we had one or two, but somebody had to be responsible for them, and so that became my job. And that meant that you had to engage with the college a little bit because of supervising the trainees. And I started to go to the branch meetings because there were other people who were supervising trainees and we needed to talk together. And at the branch meetings, it became apparent after a while that somebody needed to be the branch education officer, and one way to step into that without too much grief was to become the alternate. So there was a deputy, and so I did that, which wasn't very onerous and was reasonably interesting. They sent me up to Cairns on an inspection visit to see if it was appropriate for them to have a registrar. And that was my first experience of doing some business for the college, which was quite amusing. It was nice to go back up to Cairns. I hadn't been there since I was a medical registrar, and I got to meet all the people and the medical superintendent and the radiologists up there, and it was all quite good fun. So at the end of that 2 years as the BEO alternate, I thought, well, okay, I'll become the BEO. And at that time, the training scheme was expanding very rapidly. In fact, almost as soon as I became BEO, the state government decided that they would add another 12 registrars to the program, so we went from 25 registrars to 37 or something, and the program initially was split between Royal Brisbane and PA, and we decided that we would amalgamate the whole thing into a statewide program with training hubs at the PA and the Royal, but the ability to rotate the registrars all over the place. And the reason we did that was because some places were having trouble keeping their consultants. So Townsville was the particular trouble, was that they were having trouble recruiting consultants, and so then you would find that you had trainees up there who suddenly had no supervision. So we wanted to make it much more fluid and be able to put trainees where the supervision was appropriate. And because we had this central pool of money from the 12 registrars, we were able then to dole it out centrally. But it meant that the BEO suddenly became a much more important part of the arrangement, and because the BEO then suddenly had control over where the registrars were placed. And because we brought it all in centrally, we then had a centralised appointment system, so to recruit people, and so people then, the registrars wanting to get onto the program then had to write to me, and I organised a series of interviews and shortlisting and all those sort of things, and we appointed people. And I did that without any sort of secretarial help. I just did it out of my Gmail account, which in retrospect was terrifying because I could have got it so badly wrong. In fact, I'm amazed that I never, as far as I'm aware, I didn't really make too many horrendous errors. It would have been quite possible for me to ring people up and tell them that they'd got a job and then find that I'd given too many jobs away. Like, that would be the sort of mistake I could easily make without somebody else to check what I was doing. The only mistakes I did make is I appointed at least a couple of people who subsequently dropped off the program. And so they turn out to have been, we should have been able to identify them through the interview process, but it's well known that interviews are not very good at trying to work out who's going to make it and who's not. There are some warning signs about a couple of those people, but really it was not too bad being the BEO. I quite enjoyed it, and then because the BEO had to give reports to the branch, and the branch, I became friendly with the people on the branch, and then it became obvious that when Liz Carter didn't want to be the branch chair anymore, I thought, well, why don't I do it? In fact, it turned out to be a lot less work than being the branch education officer, and suited me well. And I had a very helpful secretary and treasurer, and I had a happy existence as branch chair. You got to see quite a lot of interesting stuff come across your desk. At that time, you didn't have a very strong relationship with the college. The branch chairs didn't come into the college very much, but that changed while I was branch chair. We started having a regular branch chairs meeting in the college, and so I got to know the college a little bit more. And then after I'd done that for a while, I handed over to John Corness, and I was in the middle of thinking about moving to Melbourne, and I was going to move to the Alfred where Dinesh Varma is, and then suddenly the college asked for somebody to replace a vacancy, to fill a vacancy on the board which came up for one reason or another. And Dinesh was the president at that time, and I thought, well, okay, I'm going to be working with Dinesh, and I'm quite interested in what the board does, and so I applied for that, and it was just appointed, and I think the board just made the appointment, and I knew several of the board members already. I knew Greg from the local branch here, and I knew Dinesh because I was going to work in Melbourne. So they knew who I was, and they knew that I was going to be not too much trouble on the board, and so they appointed me. And then in the following year, I had to go through an election process, and for some reason the fellows elected me. So then I had my position was sort of endorsed. So I've been on the board for 2 years, and it's been a very interesting 2 years. It's funny how the board is about the size of a platoon, so there's quite a bit of bonding that goes on between the board members, and we know each other reasonably well now. And the board has a lot of interesting things which come through the agenda. All college business which is too exciting or too difficult or too inflammatory to be dealt with at a lower level comes up to the board. And so we have these fascinating agendas with all kinds of interesting things. Some things that you think, well, yeah, it's obvious what to do with that, and I'm glad they've asked me my opinion about it because I know what to do about those things. Some things which are not obvious what to do about them, and the board has to do quite a bit of thinking and reflection and discussion about what to do, and quite often the board does things which they're often successful. Things that the board does. Sometimes they don't work out so well, but it's a fascinating thing to be involved in. And I've enjoyed being on the board. In fact, I think I'm going to apply to be re-elected, because I think you do get better at these things as time goes on, and I think the experience and the prior knowledge of what's gone before sort of informs how you work on things in the future. In fact, I've enjoyed it enough that it's made me apply to be on the Medical Board of Queensland, which is a sort of similar thing, but it's quite a bit more of a time commitment, and it's much more of a sort of dealing with complaints thing, whereas our board doesn't have to deal with all that many complaints. It has much more sort of strategic intent than the Medical Board of Queensland. But I don't know whether I've been appointed to the Medical Board of Queensland. We'll see.
Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Upon reflection, which moment in your career are you most proud of?
That's difficult. But that is difficult. All doctors, I think, have very strong memories and feelings about exams because they're so unpleasant. Postgraduate medical exams are very unpleasant, and because so much hangs on them. Like, it's easy on the other side of those exams to say, oh, those are just exams, but at the time they seem like a real roadblock in your life. And so this is rather solipsistic. Like, everybody has the same things. Like, it's a big relief when your exams are over, and so you tend to look back on those with a great deal of pleasure. But probably that's not very important in the scheme of things. I remember, more importantly, I remember being proud of being able to do endovascular aneurysm repair. So when I was a medical student and a junior doctor, stents were in their infancy, but it seemed to me obvious that if you could put a stent inside an artery, then you should be able to cover that stent with some material and fix a defect in the arterial wall. And I was probably thinking about those things when I was a medical student, but in fact, of course, other people all around the world were thinking the same thing. And a few groups, one in Argentina and one in Australia, were already doing experiments in humans on exactly that, making stent grafts and implanting them in people. And I managed to get myself involved in an animal program in the UK, where we put some stent grafts into an animal model of aneurysm. And when I was looking around trying to get a fellow position, I wanted to go to a place where we would be able to do some of that stent grafting for aneurysm repair. In fact, this was another terrible wasted opportunity. You just can't know at the time. But instead of going to Toronto, I should have gone to Perth. And it was idiotic. I just hadn't appreciated what they were doing in Perth. Perth was really leading the world in terms of endovascular aneurysm technology. And in fact, the devices that we still use today were based on what they did in Perth. But anyway, I didn't do that, and so it wasn't until I came back to the Gold Coast that we were able to think about doing endovascular aneurysm repair. It was just coming to market in Australia. Commercial availability of grafts was just starting in 97, 98 when I arrived on the Gold Coast, and I had a good friend who was my vascular surgery colleague, Jonathan Stewart, who was also interested in doing it, and so we went to Perth to train there, and we had David Hartley come up to be a proctor. David Hartley was initially a radiographer, but he was the designer of some of the original stent grafts. In fact, the original stent graft deployment system had his name appended to it. It was called Hartley Lawrence Brown. Lawrence Brown was the vascular surgeon. And so David Hartley came across to the Gold Coast and helped us do our first couple of cases. And so I had been talking about endovascular aneurysm repair and studying and doing lectures about it. And it wasn't until 1999 that we were actually able to do some cases in the Gold Coast. And I remember being very happy with that. There was a local surgeon called Jeff Miller. I had given a talk about endovascular aneurysm repair when I was here in 95 to a local medical meeting. And Jeff Miller was teasing me about, you'll never get to do that. And when we did our first case, which was in 1999, I met Jeff Miller on the street as I was walking out, and he said, you're looking very pleased with yourself. What have you been doing? And I said, we did an endovascular aneurysm repair, which you said that we'd never be able to do. So that was very exciting, and we subsequently built up quite a big program of endovascular aneurysm repair. I've probably done about 600 grafts now, and I became a proctor for Cook and went around Australia teaching other people how to do it, and went across to New Caledonia and taught some French surgeons how to do it. It was a pretty interesting time. So that was a big deal during my career, endovascular aneurysm repair. I still get to do a bit of it. Even now, we just did one on Thursday.
Yeah, fabulous. As an industry mentor, do you have any advice for upcoming radiologists?
Well, I'm currently trying to tell them not to be frightened about machine reporting, because a lot of them are troubled by it. It's analogous to the previous worry. They used to worry that too many radiologists were being trained and that they wouldn't get jobs, which was clearly absurd. There've always been too few radiologists, and in fact, in the UK, that's turning into a major crisis now. And so they used to say, they used to complain, there'll be no jobs for us. When we graduate, there'll be no jobs for us. And I used to say to them, the reverse is true. When you're a consultant, you will be begging to have more colleagues because you will have way too much work. You won't be able to take your holidays. You'll be fighting with other radiologists over school holidays. You want more colleagues, not less. And I think, so now, in a similar way, I say to them, don't worry about machine radiology. It's going to make your life better rather than worse. It's never going to put you out of a job, but it's going to take away from you the drudgery that you want to get rid of now. So I've got that advice for them. I think if I was going around again, I would have spent more time coding. It would have been very useful to be able to code and to be a bit more proactive about IT. Radiologists have not been very good at knowing more about IT than IT people, which otherwise you tend to be a bit led by IT people into things that you didn't really want, or the IT people often don't really know what your goals are. Your goals are slightly different from theirs. That they want security and reliability, whereas you want usability. So I think if I was going around again, I would have done some coding, and I would have tried to keep more abreast of what was going on in the world of IT. one absurd thing, for example, is that we ended up buying IT systems from film companies, which is ridiculous, because film companies could see that their business was going to go out the window, like AGFA, for example. They suddenly turned themselves into computer companies and came along and sold us computers. And because we knew them, oh yeah, AGFA, yeah, now they sell us a computer. Well, why would those people be any good at that? But the problem is that the people who were good at computers weren't really engaged in that market. So anyway, it would have been better, especially seeing as I had an interest in computers, it would have been better to be more interested and more knowledgeable about computers. And that's been a source of a bit of regret over my career, is that I probably could have had more influence and better influence over IT decisions in the hospital if I'd been a bit more engaged in it. But of course, we all have other things to do, and I've been very engaged in interventional radiology and building that up and learning stuff and whatnot. And so I sort of took my eye off the ball a little bit about IT. But for my colleagues now, for our juniors, I would say make sure that you engage properly with that, particularly with machine radiology coming along, because we need to be in control of that and be leading it rather than being led by somebody else.
In your opinion, how can the college draw on the knowledge of our established members and engage their association with the college?
I think the college is doing tremendously much better than it used to in terms of member engagement, and college staff are to be congratulated on the fact that the college is perceived with much greater affection by the members than it used to be. So I don't really have any sort of groundbreaking ideas for doing even better in member engagement than we are already. I think the college has made tremendous progress in that. There are still some people out there, I guess, like me, who, I fell into engagement with the college by chance. It would be good if there was some mechanism of drawing them in, of giving them some minor things to do that would make them feel that, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but that's certainly how I ended up coming into college activities, was just by being given a few small tasks which turned out to be quite rewarding to do. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who aren't very engaged with the college, who've got some time and some energy and some ideas, but I don't have any well-formed idea about how to get at them.
Pin them down somewhere.
Yeah.
We touched on this briefly, the future of radiology. We're talking about computerization, automation, but is there other things that you can see in the future of radiology? Or is this automation is just really?
Yeah, I think that machine radiology is really going to be a game changer. I was very impressed with Paul Chang's talks to the ASM in Adelaide. So Paul Chang is a professor of radiology from Chicago, who I think had done a lot of thinking about how that machine reporting is going to change the way we are, and so machine reporting will do a lot of the drudgery, and that frees us to do something else. Well, what will those things be? Well, one of the things that they'll be is that we'll be able to engage much more appropriately with our colleagues. So at the moment, we don't go to that many multidisciplinary team meetings. Sometimes they have a radiologist at them, but there are many meetings going on around a hospital where there's no radiologist. There'd be a lot of times, many GPs would very rarely engage with a radiologist. And so not having those monstrous reporting burdens means that we're able to go out into the hospital and to go to those meetings and value add at that level, and also to go and engage with the GPs and go and give them talks about things and ring them up and be available to advise them on the phone. And in other words, our consulting role with other doctors will become much more important again. And certainly when I was training, that's the role that we played, principally because there was no PAC system. So anybody who wanted to see some X-rays, mostly had to come down to the X-ray department to see them, and would engage with the radiologist and say, hey, can we look at those scans with you? And that was you knew that you were adding value to their care of the patient. And it was also made your day much more interesting to be engaging with people. It's very much a two-way process. Not only you telling them what's on the scans, but they're telling you what they're going to do about it. And so that was a very, sort of pivotal part of the management of that patient. Whereas now, because PACS allows the pictures to be distributed out to the wards, that means that the clinicians aren't under any obligation to come down to X-ray more. They'll often just look at the pictures on their own, on their ward round with their juniors and the nurses, and come to their own conclusions. And that interaction with the radiologist is lost. And radiologists have been quite naughty about that. Because they've got so much work to do, they've been starting to close the door of the reporting room, and they don't really welcome the intrusion. And Paul Chang asked how many people have the door of the reporting room closed or locked. Quite a few people put their hands up so that the reporting room's locked. So that seems to me we've sort of lost our way a little bit. That's not what I hoped for when I was training in radiology, but I think it may well be what we're able to go back to once machine reporting comes along.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to share today? A special story or anecdote?
I was trying to think about that. I was asking my wife, can I think of something amusing to do with the college? And she was saying, well, it's not a very humorous sort of organisation, really. But she recalled how when our son was born, we were given a wicker bassinet, like a basket which sits in a frame. But it was very old, and the bottom of it was all rucked up. So she wanted to flatten it out, and the only things that came to hand were my copies of Granger and Allison, which was a huge 3-volume radiology textbook that we had to read in the 90s. And so she put the 3 volumes of Granger and Allison into the floor of the cot, and that made it nice and flat, and then she covered it over with some blankets. And there they remained for the next 10 years. And I never knew what happened to them. I had to buy myself another copy. And sometime later, she gave the bassinet to somebody else and took it all to pieces, and there found my copies of Granger and Allison. So they came in useful for something, because I certainly never read them.
We won't tell Dr. Allison that.
No.
Dr. Snow, this concludes our interview today. So thank you so much for your time. The information that you've given really has been a valuable asset for the RANZCR archive, and also for the generation of radiologists and radiation oncologists to come.
Thank you, Eva.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the 90th Anniversary Podcast series by RANZCR. Stay tuned for more episodes featuring the remarkable stories of our members. You can find more information and updates about our 90th anniversary celebrations on our website and social media channels. Until next time, thank you for listening and being a part of this milestone celebration.